So, of course, welcome. This is the third and final week of the CICK podcast and broadcast series. And this is a partnership between CICK Smithers Community Radio, Houston Public Library, and Smithers Public Library. So just a quick recap from last week. We went over news journalism with Dan Messick. We went over how to prepare yourself and your guest to speak when you're going to be recording yourself. And typically that's in an interview scenario. But actually, as Michelle shared with me, some listening to speaking while recording, it's not just, it was a table discussion. So that was pretty cool to hear that kind of be utilized right away. We also shared how to make a skeleton for your show. So please just leave a note for me in the chat if what you need is access to any of the references that I made last week. Oops. And then we also encouraged you to record something of yourself and then share that with me as well. So this week we are going to cover practical ways to record sound. We're going to cover software as well, downloads, and how your show and your files can look, because I find that I've mentioned this before, but when you're editing audio, you kind of like your ears just get tired of it, and it's really hard to pick up on the sounds and the details that you're trying to listen for. So we're going to look at sound as well today. Also, I'm going to talk about editing and approaching editing. All people who edit sound and radio and podcasts, you create your own style, but it's helpful to know kind of what to prioritize if this is your first time at it, making a show, making a podcast. So creative writing. So this is our week's presentation. It's so good. We're going to hear from, as I mentioned, Ann-Marie Hak. And I'm very excited that we're going to be, that's the third and final presentation that we have. And the last part of this workshop today will be next steps and way to make your show, plus just like some links that I've mentioned as well. So I'm going to give you like a one sheet of kind of a takeaway. So let's start on sight and sound. Since this is a small group as well, by the way, if you have a question, just raise your hand or unmute yourself and interrupt me, because I'm generally looking at my notes and then the presentation as well. So yeah, feel free to just pop in. And I'm gonna do something really unprofessional, but I'm actually just gonna stop sharing this screen just for a moment, because I changed that I can't hear the sound on entry, and now I'm just worried that if someone does show up, I won't be able to hear. Okay, thank you. Going back to sharing. Okay, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to go over some templates of what your show can look like on the types of shows that you can build. So in this, I'm only going to show you on Audacity. The reason being is that, first off, at CICK, we use Audacity. It's what we train people on. It's what everyone records their show on, especially when you're working in the station. So I'm just going to stick with that today. But if you do continue on with training after this series, and you're someone who is a Mac user like me and you'd rather learn on GarageBand, we can do that as well. But I'm just going to stick with Audacity for now, just for simplicity. But as mentioned, I can also use Audacity on my Mac. So it's PC and it's Mac friendly. It is quick, easy multi-track recording. You can set your inputs up by using an external or an internal mixer. And something that I found really groovy about using Audacity is that if I couldn't find something, there is a video for pretty much every function that you want to use on there, because even though it is pretty simple, you can get into the weeds and you can become overwhelmed. As mentioned, but we'll train you at the station as well. So a couple of the different types of shows that you would do. The first one that I want to go over is the simplest, which is one host with music and or sound. So typically this is already sound that you've recorded, and these are files that you can drop in. As you see here, this is my voice here, and then I just have music down here. There's two here because it comes in as a stereo track. By the way, typically most MP3s that you are going to use will be a stereo track, so it will appear as two on Audacity. But this is straightforward, super simple. And the sound looks pretty good too. It looks like I'm coming in a little quiet here. So I would probably bring that up, but this looks pretty groovy. And as you can see, I've moved this track to start at the faded out smaller part, kind of at the end of me singing, at the end of me speaking here. The next session that you could be created, that the next kind of template and way that you could create a show, and a very typical show type, is 2 hosts. And I have here and pre-recorded intro and outro. The reason why I include pre-recorded intro and outro is you will want to give yourself cheats and hacks to making your show, the editing of your show, faster and faster every time. And something that I encourage everyone to do is pre-record that intro. So hello and welcome to CICK News. CICK News is a twice weekly news show that focuses on news about the Skeena region of northern BC, blah, 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 blah. And you just want to hear that every time. You want people to know that when they hear that, that show is starting as well. So you become recognizable by just using the same sound. So your tracks, so in this case, it would be, I only have 3 tracks here. Voice 1 from host 1, 2, which is host, the second host or the guest, and then your intro, outro, or auxiliary sound is the 3rd track here. Obviously, it's going to look a little bit longer and more complicated the more you have. And generally, you won't have edits. You won't have edits the exact same way that I have them here, but for sake of just showing simply how many tracks you're using. Michelle, do you have a question? But also just something just to clarify as well is that also, I would hope that you're recording your voice and your guest's voice or your host's voice on separate, or your co-host on separate tracks, because you might have different quality of voice, different ways of speaking, and you can edit it a lot easier. And then if one person talks over the other person, you won't you'll just drive yourself cuckoo banana trying to edit one person's voice if it's on the same track. Now we have where we get into more of like a woven narrative style. And this here is what I call multiple voices plus VO, which is voiceover. So typically you still have one person kind of leading the tale. It's the host of the show, and you're incorporating clips, different voices. And generally this is a heavily edited podcast. This isn't the same as a roundtable. A roundtable can actually be one track. It can just be everybody talking over each other because you'd want that to be conversational. You can get into the weeds here with music beds, which means if there's a moment where you want to just take a beat and stop all of the talking that's been going on, you just play a little bit of music. That's called a bed. So it's like a bed track, and usually it's just instrumental. It's not a lot of vocals, because you're actually just giving your listener a bit of an ear break. And so so if you were editing a show and you had multiple people, again, everyone gets their own tracks, because then you can handle their levels and equalize the sound differently for what that voice or what that music asks for. Now, this does take some planning. This is going to take the most work. And so when it looks like more work, or when it looks like more tracks, I mean, it is more work. Good planning and good scripting if you're going to do something like this. Generally, whenever I make a show that's a woven narrative, I am writing out just like, play this clip here, here's my voiceover, instrumental music here, play it out. Like I have to see it like that so that I have something to follow. Something that I want to go over, and again, I'm going to try to kind of just go over this a little bit quicker, is if you're planning on doing an interview show, there are a couple ways that you can record interviews. And I do have phone/Zoom calls, but I'm going to go into it. That's actually not always just Zooms. So, and again, this is pertinent because during the pandemic, it's been rare that you can just get together with someone or invite them into the studio or show up and share the same microphone. Those days are not really happening so much anymore. So typically, and myself included, I've had to change to doing almost all of my interviews over the phone, which is a bit of a bummer. But there are some web-based software that's created for specifically this purpose, and I'm so thankful that they did. So at our station, at CSEK, the radio station, which is in the train car in the Central Park parking lot in Smithers, we use mixers, which do all of the work to create channels and record separately. But if you have to do it from home, you'll need an internal mixer, which you can create if you're techie. It includes lots of different downloads and configuring your sound to recognize different channels and different inputs, and also how they output them as a separate channel. Like, it takes a little bit of work. Or you can use web-based software that already does it. So the list that I'm about to show you, it doesn't include everything, but it's the ones that I've had some personal experience with that I thought work great. So you can record your Zoom call. This is like really straightforward because most people have used Zoom, and it's not too new of technology. And as you may or may not know, you can just record your Zoom call. The downfall of that, the simplicity of that, is that first you can see your guest, so it's kind of nice because you can make a bit of that connection. And most people have used Zoom, so it's not like introducing to something they've not heard of. The only downfall, though, is that it's one channel for Zoom. I believe you have the option for multi-track recording if you have a paid-for version of it, but I find that to be a bit of a bummer. Something that I love using, which actually Ann-Marie and I used when we did our interview, is called Uber Conference, which is also now called Dialpad. You can record up to 45 minutes for free. It emails you separate files, or it keeps it in your account that you create separate files. It keeps your history. And also you can invite your guest to use their phone to do the interview. So while you can be using your microphone attached to your computer or your microphone headset that you have, your guest can answer their phone and speak to you just on their phone. A little caveat is that it has to be it can't be a landline. It has to be a cell phone, because you send them a link. So I'm just going to drop a link in our chat, which is with Uber Conference Dialpad, if you want to go a little bit further with it. Let me get rid of chat here. You can also use video on Uber Conference as well now, but I find that it's really great just for hosting your interview, your phone interview. And you can sign up. They don't ask for your credit card information or anything like that. Another one to use is, excuse me here, clicking on the wrong thing, is Zencaster, which has a $20 a month business profile, but the hobbyist profile is like, you can record something up to like 15 hours in a month, or maybe even more for absolutely free. And Zencaster does the same thing, but Zencaster is computer to computer. But what's nice about Zencaster too is, like, you just email them the link, they click on the link, and you open it up, and then you're speaking to each other. It doesn't start recording immediately, so you let them know, okay, we've done our context, whatever, now I'm going to start recording. And that's actually when your time and your hours start counting as well. So I'm going to drop Zencaster into the link here as well for you. Let's see. So again, the benefits of using the web-based stuff that I've just went over is that you don't need to be techie for those to work for you. And it's just really nice. It's a really nice way to start working with interviews, because then you can start to care about sound quality and EQing and using the plugins that Audacity or GarageBand or whatever other digital audio workspace that you're using has. But it's a good way to start practicing. And also too, it's very simple and straightforward. So it's not having to train your interviewee how they can be interviewed by you, which is also nice. Okay. If there aren't any questions, I'm going to go into editing. And as a general rule, it's going to hurt a little bit. The reason why I say it's going to hurt is because the thing to say is that you should edit until it hurts. So I've had some very serious late night editing sessions that feel painful because I'm getting rid of so much what we call good tape. But the rule is that you serve the story. You're not trying to serve yourself. or be the most clever. You're not even serving your guests or your audience. So with that in mind, the most time consuming part of everyone's pre-recorded show is editing to serve the story the best. You want to keep it simple. Don't create work for yourself that you can avoid by cajoling the style of your show. So think back to those 3 screenshots that I just showed you. Obviously, the more complicated it looks, the more complicated it is, which means the more time it's going to take to do it. So if you can simplify by maybe just starting off with 2 hosts and then dropping in a little bit of music here and there because you want to get kind of into the flow of editing, it's like any other practice. You start off kind of slow and clunky and maybe hating it, but then you slowly start to chug along and then you've found your rhythm. Yeah, don't set out to make a first time show that requires a lot of finagling. You can complicate these things with needing sound to be perfect and voices to be rich and also the perfect song for the fadeaway, but you can also keep it simple. If you remember in last week's, I played a couple of clips, and one of the clips was a podcast called Zealot, and she's just putting a Yeti microphone in front of her. And in that instance, she was speaking to her guest, which was over the computer. That's not a heavily edited show. And even her edits when you can hear it, it doesn't sound like, it's not the cleanest, but I love that show. And I've listened to hours and hours of that show because the content was worth it. And I loved the podcast. If you are planning on scripting, by the way, like you can script things. You should always write for your voice, not for a reader, by the way, because you want to remember that you're using the medium of sound. Like someone reading a story, unless they're really practiced in reading something, generally it's too monotonous for someone to listen to. So again, try to make it that the sound is what you're gathering people with. And if you can keep that sound to be conversational, or if you can keep that sound to just be 2 people who are having a really good who are having a really good interview and they're engaged with each other, that is good enough to start with. Consider how many people you need to make this show happen. So unless you have funding to hire out the stuff that you don't know how to do and you don't want to learn how to do, you just want to make it that it's something that you can do each week, that you can kind of allocate the right amount of time for something that you're volunteering or something that you're likely doing for free, because you don't really want to start volunteering for something that just isn't fun, because then you start to ask why you're volunteering to do it. Most CICK DJs are the host, the producer, and the marketer of their show. And it does sound like a lot, but you start with the part that you like the most and you try to do that best. And then you can start bringing in elements that make things more complicated. Also, I personally think that editing is the most fun part of creating a podcast. Essentially, you have the last say on what goes and what stays in that show. Of course, it's important to include that you don't get to change the context of someone's answer or question or quote just because you could. Your boss is still the best podcast that it can be. And it's tempting to make your show really, really clever, but your listeners aren't waiting for the most clever podcast they've ever heard. They're still probably listening because the title of the show lets you know what it's about, or you've marketed it in a way that makes people feel like they're going to want to spend time with it. This is something I like to tell everyone, is like, don't start by buying the software and then figuring once you have the software, then you're going to start being a great editor. Work with the free stuff first, because they're not that vastly different. As someone who now does use software that I do pay for, I was editing on GarageBand. I was editing really complicated podcasts on GarageBand, and it taught me what I would pay for, and that actually helped me decide what software I finally did want to get. So do it with the free stuff that doesn't have everything is a click or a keyboard shortcut away, because then I kind of feel like if you're not willing to simplify or do it that way, then maybe you want to just look at doing a live show and not worrying about pre-recording, because either which way, whether it's the simplest software or the free stuff, if you just hate doing it, find someone else to do that for you, maybe. Okay. We're at the halfway mark here, so I'm going to switch over to our first presentation, and I'm so excited because I've actually heard your presentation, so I'm very excited for everyone to hear it as well. And it's by Ann-Marie Hak. So Ann-Marie, could you start by introducing yourself?
Display settings. How's this? Can everyone see it? Good.
Oh, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna just jump a couple of slides. Get back to, let's see here. So, okay, we're all good. So what is possible for you? We're going to envision where your story wants to be shared. And again, the importance of this is that you're going to have time restrictions on your story, whether it's a 10-minute short film or a 300-page novel. And for different mediums of writing as well, there's different formats of writing. So being aware of those two crucial things, time restrictions and the format, are really going to help you in the process of writing as well. So I'm just going to go through a few of the options of what's possible for you. And this is going to seem like a major flex, which it kind of is, by giving you examples of work that I've done. But I do want you to imagine, if there's a story that you've been thinking of for a while, just see if your story fits in any of these mediums and which one might call out to you. Do you want to tell your story visually, like through a short film about a Newfie stepfather trying to bond with his grieving Filipino stepson on a camping trip at a wishing fall? What about in a comic book featuring funny conversations you and your mom have? How about online or physically in a book for everyone to read about the things you learned from a narcissistic father? Or are you collaborating with others to explore audio in a supernatural Buffy meets Stranger Things kind of thriller podcast? Whatever medium you tell your story in, the most important thing is to be authentic. In some cases, you may be writing someone else's story. I've actually been working on a screenplay about the time my mom snuck out of a convent in the Philippines to go see Jaws in theaters. I want to be authentic to her story, but I have to accept that I won't get every detail accurate. So how do you solve this? First, acknowledge the responsibility you are undertaking and accept that you aren't perfect. Then ask, what is the heart of this story, the theme? Does the plot point you wrote serve this theme or not? This will help make it easier to know what to cut and what to keep, especially when you're being shared someone else's story. Being able to discern if what has been shared and if the event that happened still reinforces that theme will just make it easier for you to know what to include. So, oops, I'm sorry. For example, the story about my mom, the real story is when she was at the theater, a bomb actually went off. But in a 7-minute version of that story I wrote, a gun goes off instead, because to tie up loose ends, it's a lot easier in a 7-minute short script to tie up loose ends of a gun going off than it is a bomb. To write great fiction is a whole presentation on its own, so I'm going to tell you the fundamentals that you will always come back to time and time again. And these are, like, whether you're writing Harry Potter or Outlander, you will always ask these 3 questions. What are the rules of the world? And I want to note here that limits make stories interesting. So I actually encourage you, when you're world building, especially like a fantasy world, give yourself the limitation of only having 1 magical item. And that might seem terrifying. It definitely was for me in my writing classes. But the point of this is that the world building part is kind of the extra. And the other 2 things I'm going to be talking about are what truly make that story. And I want to include some examples here for you that when we think about rules for world building, for example, magic in Harry Potter is the food coming to life at Hogwarts, but not in the real world. And time travel in Outlander is limited to Claire being one of the few people that can travel back and forth. The second question you want to look at actually has a few parts to it, and it's the basics of character building. And they are always these 3 questions. What does your character want? Who or what is in their way? What are their flaws, making it hard for them to reach their goal? So for example, Claire wants to get back to her timeline, but she can't because she's being forced to follow these Scotsmen, the who's in her way, and gets into trouble often because she speaks her mind and doesn't listen to men. So her quote unquote flaw. Some advanced character building is a question of how does their strength impede them? For example, in the same example of Outlander, Claire's strength as a doctor causes her trouble because she gets mistaken as a witch in this timeline. And finally, the best stories are the ones where you can strip all the magic away and still be rich, left with a rich storyline. That comes from complicated relationships. Ask yourself questions like, who are your characters close to? Who do they avoid? What secrets do they keep from their best friend? These are some simple, basic questions to give your characters more dynamic. All right, let's play a game. What do you think these two people are saying? What assumptions did you make about them based on how they are dressed, their body language? If you were writing this scene, how would you invert people's general assumptions and surprise them? Finding the voice of your character, I've got just a couple basic tips for you. One is to make a collage about them. This is really fun. You can just Google anything and put together what they look like, what their likes are, dislikes. This is mostly great for helping you describe them. A second tip I have is mimic them. What do they sound like? What words do they use often? I actually know a ton of writers that will act out their characters to ensure that like they're truly speaking from their voice. But perhaps my favorite of all time is to observe others. People watching is just like my favorite thing. I have an entire note folder on my phone dedicated to my former used car sales manager because of the way he talked. He would always talk in like these Top Gun references when describing like car sales. And I would just be making notes in the meeting room only of his dialogue because I felt like I know one day I'm going to come back and use him as a character. Storyboarding. Personally, I don't storyboard because it takes me longer to draw something than it does to write it out. But I would say the most important thing about storyboarding is drawing from the perspective of your protagonist, or an omniscient perspective, which is an all-seeing view. I also have a resource for you from one of the greatest storyboard artists I know. Oh, and I'm just realizing that slide didn't go through, but I'll make sure to give this to Pamela so she can make sure to send it to you. So this is supposed to feature a picture of Hayao Miyazaki, who is one of the best storyboard artists I know. If you don't know him, that's okay. He's done works like Spirited Away, Princess Mononoke, Howl's Moving Castle, a lot of animations. There is a link at the bottom of the slide that you can see, which will be given to you. And it's a 4-part documentary about him as a filmmaker and a storyteller. Why you'll like this is because he doesn't actually create his films through scripts, which is really unheard of. They're all from storyboards. So his process is just in its own other realm. So this is a really great resource for you if you're someone that is really drawn to storyboarding. So I've covered a lot, so let me just do a quick recap on creative storytelling. So the medium, know where you want to share your story so you can properly format it and follow time restrictions. Authentic storytelling is making yourself accountable to the truth and being flexible to honoring the theme. The 3 building blocks of fiction, and really any story, is the world, character, and relationships. For finding the voice of your character, make a collage, mimic, or observe others to create a unique and authentic voice. Storyboarding, draw from the perspective of your protagonist or an omniscient view. And finally, if I could leave you with the one advice I've carried with me throughout my time in creative writing, it would be this: take what works for you and leave the rest. I rest. I encourage you to ask others, especially in this group and other workshops, like what methods they have used, and see which ones you can apply that work for you. Share what you've tried, especially the ones that haven't worked for you, and make up your own process. Those are usually the best. What questions do you have?
Actually, I have a question, Anne-Marie. I wonder, because I know that you also worked as a journalist, so I wonder what you've learned from creative writing that you wish you knew when you were a journalist.
Oh, that's a great question. I think I learned this a lot. Like, I learned it actually from creative writing. The way you can describe someone in journalism was something I never did in the year, almost a year and a half I did as a Houston Today reporter. So when I interviewed people, I didn't describe, kind of the scene or the tone. And I never knew that was like a place creativity could come into. I think I'm trying to think of some articles I remember reading. Unfortunately, they don't come to mind, but I would encourage you to read a few different articles. And there's definitely some journalists where they're very good at describing a scene or the interview of someone with also still being in that professional boundary of not inferring or putting words or assumptions into the context of what's being discussed. So yeah, description is a very, very powerful tool for journalism.
Yeah. I find too that it's really tempting to just once you do start using that as a tool, like description as a tool, is like to over describe things, describe things that really don't need describing. Like I was writing something the other day and I was like really going into detail about what a bowl of French onion soup looked like, and I was like, everyone knows what French onion soup looks like, and I just selected it and deleted it all because it was just like, we don't need this. No one needs to hear this description.
Yeah. I remember one of my favorite writing classes or lectures was, there was this whole paragraph about I think it was someone explaining a part in the Bible, and it was Jesus had cascading tears down his face, and it flowed like this river, and it just went elaborate and elaborate and elaborate, and it was there was kind of this, even when you read it, you felt like there was almost this pretentious poeticness to it. You were like, ah. And so then as an assignment during the lecture, we were asked how would you edit this? What would you take out? So then, we were whittling away, and this massive paragraph we turned into a couple longer sentences and stuff. And then the prof, it was so good, I won't forget it, was yeah, that's really good. Do you want to know what it actually says? And then he turns the slide and it's only 2 words: Jesus wept.
Right.
And it was just sometimes that is the most clearest way to communicate a story.
Yeah.
And I think that is also something I really took away. Sometimes I think I have almost a bad habit of not including enough information in writing or in a description. But I think it's a really good habit to practice, especially in your first drafts, of just kill your darlings, because you can always make new darlings. You are a writer, you are a creative flow of a channel. That is your gift. You will always find it, the darlings. So don't be afraid to cut it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely worth saying as well that much like in music, in podcasts, space is a good thing. In a story, sometimes too, you're oh, but I feel that'd be visual, and if it was a movie, we need to describe it, and it's you don't, because the space allows the listener to get, if you're trying to write something scary or something like that, it's leaving it time that you don't have to give away what the monster is. You can just let them consider how bad it would be if they were in the situation and what they would be the most terrified of as well.
Yeah. It looks like Michelle has a question.
Oh, great.
Oh, I think she can't unmute herself.
Oh my God, this is me again. I'm so annoyed with myself. And I'm like, yeah, go ahead. Okay. There we go. I think that works now.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
That's too funny. Just quick question. You talked about setting those bounds, that the time. So pick your format and then pick goalposts, I guess. So for example, this screenplay about your mother, you pick 7 minutes. Like, how do you come to 7 minutes? Like, do you establish that after a quick first draft and go, okay, this is about 7 minutes, or is it set ahead of time?
That was 100% set ahead of time. So it was an assignment for school. They said you have to write a 7-minute screenplay. And I'm like, okay. So that was one of the most interesting stories to me, something I felt really excited about. So I did write that into a 7-minute short. And I would say it's a really excellent question you brought up, because I think, it's good to know, again, format and time restrictions. But maybe I should have also mentioned the question before of like, how long do you want to tell that story for? How long do you think that it needs to be told for it to truly be authentic? So I know after especially writing that 7-minute short, there's no way I would make that into a film, because the story and the complexity of that theme, especially because it deals with freedom and religion and polar opposite religious views. I realized like, oh, wow, this is so much more packed into it. This is such a rich story. It would need to be a feature film. Like, it would need to be a 2-hour film. So I'm currently trying to adapt this 7-minute short. So I can include the fact that the bomb does go off, and I can include all these other pieces that are clearly so important because they do feed back into that theme.
Very cool. I just wanted to share, my mother also went to a school of nuns, and I think she got like hit on the hands or something for drawing. She's old, but she drew a picture, I think, on her desk of Elvis, like in 1950, whatever. And she got, reprimanded for that. So anyway, not like bombs going off, but still that nun school is not the best.
I just feel like, honestly, I want more nun stories. Like, I don't want the horror nun stories. I want the other, like, I want like the deep sort of like that religious tension and that place of like, teenagers figuring out freedom and also duty, I suppose. Like, man, I don't know how my mom's gonna feel about me making this film, but I'm like, it's gonna happen. Like, on my deathbed, I will figure it out.
So we already covered that. Okay, yeah. So actually, these are my last point that I really want to hit home, which is, marketing this as a podcast and broadcast series. There's a reason why that, and that's because a lot of people don't consider that podcasts are going to be made at community radio, or that people think that podcasts and broadcasts are two very different mediums. But I firmly believe, because of my experience with radio, is what prepared me to become a podcaster. I got to, cut my teeth. I got to make mistakes. I got free training. I got access to software that I wouldn't have even known about. And I just used, like, I feel like I just utilized it as also just like a way to kind of also figure out my voice. Like, I started, it's 2021. So I've been in community radio for 11 years now. In 2 different stations in 2 different provinces as well. And actually, I met my fiance through community radio as well. Like, we met at a community radio conference and fell in love in 3 days, and we're engaged to be married down. It's Wyman Smith. Like, it's just like, I know it's not everyone's story, but it's like, it is also where I've met some like just lasting friendships that I've made. So not that that's the only reason why anyone should get involved, but it is also like, it's a place for people, right? It's community radio. So obviously, why volunteer? Because you get the training. We care a lot about your creative projects. So the reason that we're doing this series is because we don't know what people are out there thinking about doing. And the pandemic has made a lot of people like just hone in on like new things that you care about and new things that you want to do, but also like podcasting can be an endeavor for just you, or it can be a way that you're talking to, that you're still able to speak with, that you're still able to speak with and stay connected with people, but you have like a reason, like a couple of me and my friends, like, like we talked about podcast ideas, but we also just liked to have reasons to hang out and chat with each other. And if you've thought about how cool your show would be, but if only you had the time to do it, because now that we're kind of opening back up again and people are busy again, consider CICK as kind of like the timekeepers for your creative endeavors, along with the people that you can work with to make that happen as well. Don't really feel like I need to talk too much on this one. Free access to software and hardware, and as well music. So I mean, like, like if you want to learn how to like mix live sound, or if you want to learn how to, again, just podcast and do a radio show, but also get access to like things that we give our members access to as far as like our digital library goes. Hell yeah, do it at CICK. It's there for you. Okay, I say a place to meet people here, and I have this really long thing written. I'm not going to read it all. I feel like I've said it, but it's just it's also when it's not a when it's not a pandemic and when things open back up, CICK throws the best parties. Like we do like volunteer appreciation parties, and we have a curling team, and we throw the Monster Clash, which is like all vinyl DJs, and everyone dresses up, and it's just these you should go on our Facebook and just look, like the photos are insane. We do rock lotteries where like we make bands in 24 hours and then they play a show, and we give them a theme. Like 2 years, like I guess 2019, the theme was Tarantino, so people just did songs from Tarantino soundtracks, and like so good. So like we know how to throw a party. Here's just a picture of kind of our crew. We call ourselves a ragtag bunch of misfits, but it's pretty groovy how we all fit together. And of course, with the machine that is a licensed, publicly airing, not-for-profit, we gather a following of people that you might not be able to access on your own. So I'm not saying that you can't access this audience, but the cool thing about radio is it is a bit of a lottery. You don't know who's going to be driving, tuned in, or it's on in the background somewhere, and someone hears something and they want to find out more about it. It's just such a cool thing when someone calls, because they're just a person listening to the radio, and then you have this connection in this conversation. And also, like, why not participate in your community? It's local voices matter, and especially when smaller, less popular thoughts get lost in the shuffle of social media, and you can hold a conversation with your community about your community by learning and participating with community radio. Lastly, we've made strides to have remote stations set up. So we have 2 stations set up in Smithers. We have one at the Smithers Public Library, obviously at our station in the CICK train car. We also have a remote station in the Houston Public Library. And if you're in Hazleton or closer to Hazleton, at the Learning Shop in Hazleton. And so it's the same setup. It's a microphone, it's a mixer, you get the training on it, it's using Audacity, it's access to the software that I've mentioned as well. So that's pretty, we've tried to like remove the barriers of, well, I'd love to, but I don't live in Smithers. So we made it kind of just under the time here. So I do have a sheet that I'm going to share with you that I believe is, it must be in my next slide is the link to it, but I'm going to drop a link in here. So it is links of how to follow us, links of how to contact us, things that I've referenced before. And then I also have a feedback form that if you have a couple minutes, I think it's like 5 or 6 questions, you can be as lengthy or not, as succinct as you want to be with it. But I would love feedback on how this series served you and your podcast wishes. So here, let me just drop those in the chat right now to everybody. So yeah, feedback form is the top one, and then the document with links. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm just going to turn back on, I believe, to maybe me. And I invite you all, I have to ask you all, but I'm going to invite you all to unmute yourself as well. And I just thank you so much for your time and participating in this series. I've had a great time doing it.